Welcome to the GPN Technologies mid-year webinar series, Proven Strategies to Drive Your Practice Revenue to Record Heights. My name is Yvonne Pelkey, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I would just like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded, and to reduce the background noise, you are in listen-only mode. However, we do love questions and encourage you to utilize the chat feature within Zoom. You can find that down at the bottom of your screen as you hover. You'll see a little chat box become available to you. The recording will be available by the end of the week. You may locate that within the Need Help section of Edge Pro, as well as you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar. Because your feedback is invaluable for the continued success of our webinars, a survey link will be placed within the chat feature within just a few moments. At the end, please take a moment to complete the survey. Today is the fifth and final of our mid-year webinar, and our topic this afternoon is Take Your Practice to the Next Level. Today's guest speaker is going to take us on a journey that will not only help us create an action plan for continued growth of our practice, but will teach us strategies in which we can motivate our team to help us succeed our potential. And on that note, I am very excited, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Steve Vargo. Dr. Vargo, before we get started, please take a moment to share just a little bit about yourself.
Yes, well, thank you, Yvonne, for the introduction. And yes, I'm Dr. Steve Vargo. I transitioned, I guess it's been about 4.5 years now. It's gone by quick, but transitioned from clinical practice to full-time practice management consulting about 4.5 years ago. And I am optometric practice management consultant with a group called iDoc. And I'd like to think that I've, over those 4 years, I've transitioned from helping patients see better to helping doctors see better. And in terms of gaining clarity around operating their practice and hopefully helping them take their practice to the next level. And I'd like to take just a minute to define that phrase, next level, because it's not going to be the same for everybody. I think it's safe to say that the people listening to this webinar are going to be different ages, and they're going to be with practices that are at different stages of their life cycle, and they're going to have different goals, different passions. So this has much less to do with any particular strategy, but more to do with getting clear on what your next level is and helping you execute on the things that you need to do to get there. And I'll also mention that from having done thousands of consultations at this point with hundreds of different practices across the country, there's definitely more than one way to be successful in eye care. But the more practices you work with, you start to notice certain habits and commonalities of the most successful practices, the practices that continually are able to push their practice to that next level. There are certain patterns there. So that's something I hope to share with you as well, different strategies that you can extract from this and apply to your practice. Some of the learning objectives I hope to cover is first and foremost, getting really clear on what your next level is. And I like to use the analogy of two different people. One says to you, 2019 is my year. I'm going to get in shape. I'm really going to get in shape this year. Somebody else says, yes, 2019, it's my year. I'm going to lose 20 pounds. I'm going to join a gym, and I'm going to complete a 5K in under 30 minutes. Which one do you think is more likely to achieve their goal? And what I hear in the industry a lot are practices saying, I want to get in shape, but they're not real clear on what that means. It's pretty vague, I think we would agree. And really, if you're not clear on what your next level is, if you're not clear on what your goals are, how do you know when you've succeeded at that? We'll talk about an action plan to get there. We can talk about strategies all day long, but strategies are really just ideas. Another commonality on the practices that continually succeed, continually outperform the competition, is they're more apt to act on their ideas. Execution is where it's at. It's not the strategies, it's really the ability to execute on those ideas. And that becomes a really key component in your ability to take your practice to the next level. And we'll also talk about strategies to motivate your team. Because while independent optometry obviously is independent, it's not completely independent. And when you go to work and look around, there's people there that can help you get to that next level. And your ability to motivate, your ability to take your practice to that next level is very much determined and very much depends on your ability to motivate and lead the people on your team. So let's start here. Where are you going? This brings us back to that clarity component. We have an exercise we do at IDOC. It's called the 3-year growth plan. So when a new consulting member signs up, what we do is we plot out what we want the practice to look like, not what we want, what they actually want the practice to look like in 3 years. Why 3 years? It's somewhat of an arbitrary number, but at the same time, it feels like it's a reasonable time frame. I don't think any of us really knows for sure what the world's going to look like in 10 years, and we all know how quick a year goes by. So we look at that 3-year growth plan to give us some clarity around what we're striving to get to. So what I'll ask you to do, if you're in a position to do it, is start to give some thought to writing that out. What does that look like for you? And when I do this presentation live, I give people a few minutes to do this. I say, take the pen and the paper in front of you and write down what you want your practice to look like. What do you want your revenues to be? How many employees do you want to have? What do you want your brand to be known for? Get as specific and clear as you can. And then once we do that exercise, I tell them to put that to the side. And then I mentioned that it's interesting when we have this conversation with new consulting members, because so often when we're doing this exercise, the owners of practices that are more successful seem to have much more clarity around their answer. They tend to be much more specific about what they want to accomplish. And a lot of times they're really excited to tell you where they want to take the practice, what their goals are. And I find that the practices that are maybe the lower performing practices that struggle to keep up with the competition, their answers tend to be a lot more vague. I want to get in shape, but there's not a lot of clarity around what that actually means. So I really can't stress enough, if you want to take your practice to the next level, getting really clear on what that looks like. Are you ever going to be satisfied where you're at? This was a question that one of our members' staff had asked him. And she said, you're always going to these conferences, you're always coming back with these ideas, you're always setting new goals and buying new things for the practice. Aren't you ever just going to be satisfied where you're at? So what I'd like you to do is give a little bit of thought to that. If a staff member of yours asked you that, what would your response be? Well, this was his response. No, and if we ever do, then it's time for us to get out of business. And I know where he's coming at with this answer, and this is something else that I've observed in the more successful practice owners, is they have what I like to call healthy discontent. So it's kind of a term I use for people that are never completely satisfied with their business. And I think if you take that too far, and I wouldn't want anybody to be discontent all the time. Life is too short. At the same time, I think if you never look at your business through the filter of how can I make this better, there's going to be less motivation on your part to keep pushing things forward. So I do tend to see this in the more successful practices, is they're always looking at things through the filter of how can I make this better? How can we be more productive? How can we be more efficient? And I think that's a really key in continuing to move the needle on the practice and the things that need to be done to keep moving toward that next level. What could prevent you from achieving your goals? If we were to do that initial exercise where you wrote down what you want your practice to look like in 3 years, what would prevent you from potentially getting there? And again, when I do this presentation live, I'll get answers around money, education, and those are potential reasons for not accomplishing your goals. But what I notice probably more than anything would be time. And that goes for personal and professional goals. A lot of times you'll hear people say, I would like to run a marathon. I would like to learn how to play the piano. I would like to start a business if I only had more time. So I want to get in front of this because I think it's really important to consider how we prioritize our time. Because a lot of the things that you need to do to keep moving your practice to the next level can get quickly hijacked by a lot of distractions. So this is some of you might be familiar with this matrix. In case you're curious, it's right out of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it really breaks down these 4 different categories. If you look at the upper left, it's things that are urgent and important. Well, these are the things that we'll typically deal with right away. If there's a fire in the kitchen, we're going to stop what we're doing. Fortunately, these things typically just make up a very small percentage of our day. Same with the lower right-hand corner, things that are not urgent and not important, we tend to focus less on. But from a business standpoint, the 2 areas of interest are the yellow area and the lower left area. And what they've found is that low-performing businesses tend to spend a disproportionate amount of time in that lower left area. Things that are urgent, but not necessarily important. This is the practice that says, if I only had more time, but the reason they don't have time is because of all the distractions and interruptions. Practices that are high-performing businesses tend to create time to do the things that need to be done to keep moving the practice along. And they carve out time to focus on these things that are important, but not necessarily urgent. So prioritization becomes a key component in your ability to effectively move the practice forward. I've done an exercise for years that's really helped me be more productive and prioritize what I need to do. And I've done this on a personal and professional level, is I do something very similar to what I asked you to do earlier with writing down where you want to be in 3 years. And I do that, and it's a very repetitious process, but that's by design, because I want to continually reinforce in my mind what I want to accomplish and what my goals are. And then I write down 3 things I'm going to do that day that align with those goals. And I try to do those things earlier than later, because I know the farther we get into the day, the less likely I am to do them. So as an exercise, I figure if I'm remotely consistent with this, if I did this 5 days a week, 50 weeks out of the year for 3 years, I will have done almost 2,000 things that put me closer to my goal. So again, I really want you to focus on prioritization. And that's an area I spend a lot of time with practices as we're trying to implement strategies to move the practice to the next level. I do this presentation as part of a 2-hour workshop, and obviously for the sake of time, I had to cut some things out. And originally I had taken this slide out, but I added it back in because I think it's really important to focus on the why behind why we're taking our practice to the next level. We did an exercise at IDOC within the past year, I would say, where we sat down to define our why. And what we came up with is we empower independent owners to live the practice of their dreams. And some of you may be familiar with Simon Sinek, and we really drew from that. It is starting with our why. A lot of companies know what they do. A lot of companies know how they do it. But a lot of companies aren't real clear on why they do what they do. And I think if you can build an emotional reason for why you do what you do, that'll resonate much better with the people you lead on your team. And I really want to stress that taking your business to the next level requires leadership. And if you want to motivate the people that you lead, you have to help them understand why. You have to help them understand the why behind your mission and vision, and also help them see how they're not just there to do a job, but part of something bigger and more impactful. How do you motivate the people on your team? So what we've talked about so far has really been just about you, the things that you need to do. You getting really clear on what your next level is. You putting a plan in place to make sure that you're executing on the things you need to do to get there. You getting clear on the why, the purpose behind setting the goals that you're setting. In some ways, that can actually be the easy part. The more difficult part can be leading the people on your team, and you absolutely need them to be able to move things forward. And this is a question that a member of ours actually asked me a few years ago. I think I had written a blog or an article on creating a more productive staff. And he called me and he said, Steve, how do I motivate people? And I realized at that time, I really didn't have a good answer. I had worked with a lot of practices on or poor performing employees and how to get more productivity out of people, but I really didn't have a clear, coherent answer to give him at the time. So I set out to find one. And the first place I looked was my own consulting. And when we consult with members, we document the call and we categorize it. So I went back and looked at a lot of my consultations with members in this area. And what I found was about 90% of the time, I was going back into 5 different areas. There was 5 areas that I was focusing on regarding employee motivation. And while I was happy to have somewhat of a framework to operate from, I quietly asked myself, am I giving good advice? And I looked outside the industry for that answer because I wanted to see is my advice aligned with other companies that are known for creating highly motivated teams. So I studied organizations that were known for creating great service and high performing teams. And I was very happy to see that a lot of the things that I was recommending members do was very much aligned with the approach those companies were taking. I'm also going to tell you that nothing I'm going to tell you is revolutionary. Everything I'm going to tell you has been taught in business schools. It's been practiced by high-performing organizations. But I'll also tell you that most practices don't do this very well. And I feel confident in saying if you can just make improvements in these 5 areas, that it could have a dramatic impact on the motivation of your team and your ability to work together to get to your next level. So as we talk through these 5 areas, money is not one of the 5, and I wish it was. I really wish it were that easy. I wish people could call me and be having a problem with an employee, and I could just say, just give her a 50-cent raise, or just give him a 75-cent raise. And you would call me back in a couple months and say, Steve, you're a genius. The attitude is like night and day, and they're never late anymore, and it's now my superstar employee. But it usually doesn't work that way. Money tends to be, from what I've seen and what I've observed, a much better tool for retention than it is for motivation. And I don't want to overgeneralize that, because I know every time I say that to a group, there's going to be at least a handful of people that will say, well, we started spiffing our opticians, for example, and sales went up 20%. Great, keep doing it. It's working for you. All I'm saying is that if you lean on this one as a sole means of motivating people, I think you're going to find yourself disappointed from a production standpoint. Do I think money's important? Yes, I think money's very important. I think you should pay your employees a fair market rate. I really have no issue with overpaying high-performing employees. These are the people you want to keep. These are the people you want to build a brand around. But at the same time, I do think that if you really want to go deeper in motivating people, you have to look beyond just money. So let's get into some of those areas. And we talked before about creating clarity for or defining a clear vision for yourself. But that clarity can't just end with you. Your employees have to be clear on expectations as well. And doctors tend to be very clear with patients. We provide a lot of clarity with patients. I want you to take this drop. You're going to use it 4 times a day in your left eye. I'm going to have you take it for 10 days. You should start feeling better, or the eye should start looking better within 48 hours. If it's not, I want you to give me a call. I'm going to have you come back in 7 days because I want to look at the eye and make sure it's healing okay. We provide a lot of clarity for patients because we want to make sure that they're very clear on what the expectations are in terms of eye care. But do you provide that same level of clarity for your employees around business objectives? As you look at this, you might be thinking, well, of course we provide clarity. I mean, we're getting stuff done. We're seeing patients. We're We're getting work done. It's not like people are just standing around. But let me ask you a question. Do you ever have employees who make the same mistakes over and over? Do you ever have employees who argue over who's supposed to be doing what or how they're supposed to be doing it? Do you ever have employees who spend too much time on the wrong things? Interestingly, when I talk with consulting members about this issue and about underperforming employees, I find that about half the time there's an issue regarding clarity. You start to hear things around the lack of training that's taken place in the office, or we have an office manager who's not comfortable giving feedback, or our last office meeting was 6 months ago. There is a such thing as a bad hire. So there are certainly situations where an underperforming employee is not a result of poor management, but at the same time, we need to look at our role as a leader in the organization. Are we giving people the tools, training, and resources that they need to understand what they need to do to help move the practice, the organization, toward that next level? Now, as we talk about clarifying expectations, it is possible to have too many expectations. And this brings us back to prioritization. One of the first conferences that I was a part of with IDOC, I recall one of our consulting members coming up and saying how much he loved coming to the meetings. And he said, we get so much out of these meetings. I bring my whole staff. We get so many great ideas. We get really excited. We take all these ideas back to the practice, and my staff is really fired up. And within a couple weeks, we go back to doing things the way we did it before. In other words, we lost focus. So it is possible to be setting too many expectations for staff, which really brings us back to how we prioritize things. And I coach my son's baseball team. It's a little league team, and they're 9-year-olds. And my approach in coaching is this: if I see a kid doing 10 things wrong, I'll usually try to identify 1 or 2 things, maybe even just one thing. What's the one thing I could impact right now that's going to have the greatest impact on his performance? In fact, this may even be something, if I fix a lot of the other things, that will take care of a lot of the other problems going on. And I do that because they're kids. And they have short attention spans, and you can't give them too much to focus on at once, and they won't be able to process all of that. And you know what? We're the same way. Adults are the same way. And research has consistently found that we tend to be much more productive when we're focused on fewer things, which is why I really stress the value and importance of getting clear on what your goals are to make sure that you're spending more time doing the important things that need to be done to put you closer to your goals. Part of setting goals, part of getting to that next level, and part of clarity has to involve numbers too. Otherwise, we can fall into the trap of making business decisions around emotions. And recently I visited actually just last week, a handful of $1 million practices. And I was really impressed by the way things were ran there. And again, in a process of looking for consistencies there, in each one of those practices, what I found was they were very clear on their next level. They were very clear on their goals. There was a lot of clarity around that. And also, they were very driven by metrics. Decisions were made by numbers, not emotions. And with IDOC, we are very tied in with Edge Pro, and it's been incredibly valuable to our members and their ability to track numbers. And I can tell you, as a consultant, I didn't originally have access to this data, and now we do. And it's been very valuable to me as well to be able to dig deeper into a practice's numbers and have a better sense of what areas need improvement. And it's helped me a lot in my ability to give better advice and better consultation. And I'm going to turn it back over to Yvonne here a little bit, who's going to talk about Edge Pro in a little more detail.
Thanks, Dr. Vargo. One of the things that I absolutely love that you said just a little bit ago was when you're coaching your son's baseball team, that, if there's something that you could do of an impact, what might be those one or two, maybe three things that you could do that could bring great value. And I love that, because I think what a lot of times when, our practices set goals, sometimes we set too many goals and it can feel a little bit overwhelming. And so in addition to setting those clear expectations, we have to pick those one or two, maybe three things that can be most impactful to the practice. And once we can identify what those are, then to set some realistic goals. So, but before we can set those goals, we kind of need to understand where we are at the moment in order to understand where we need to go. And one of the things that I absolutely love about Edge Pro, and is definitely a resource that I have used throughout my years in working with numerous practices and teams, is one of my favorites is if we come over here to, optical overview and specifically take a look at our lenses, we can see, what areas that need some additional support. Like, right, this gives us a huge, a high level overview, so to speak. I set the time period because since we're in Q3 right now, and we want to understand what did we do in Q3 of 2018, so that we can help set some realistic numbers as we move into Q3 2019. And so, what I love about this is it gives me information, what did we do in 2018 in comparison to 2017? And so this just is a high level overview. And if I really wanted to dive a little bit deeper here, I can take a look at my staff. And I can understand, like, who are my top performers. So let's just focus on AR for an example. And I take a look at Delilah, who has 100% AR. Elton, it has 100% AR. But then if I look down here towards the bottom, Chantel and Hugh Kenny here, their averages tend to be a little bit lower. So I might want to understand, like, what is Delilah doing different than Chantel might be? And you can do this for the same thing for transitions as well as second pair cells and blue light lenses, if that's something that your practice specializes in. The other really cool thing that I absolutely love about Edge Pro is that I can take this even a level deeper, and I can understand, like, from a vision savings plan, like, where are those opportunities? So, again, if we just take a look at AR and we see that, IMED, we have an 87% AR, but we come down here to superior vision and we only provide AR to 50% of those patients. So, I would want to dive a little bit deeper. I would want to understand, where is the disconnect? What are we doing differently from team member to team member or from plan to plan? And then once we figure this information out, my next tab that I love is opportunities. And actually, I have it already up here. And so again, the same time period, July 1st through September 30th, 2018, and if we just take a look at our opportunities page, we can see, like, our greatest area of opportunity to drive additional revenue would be our AR lenses, with patient-owned frames being second. And so, when I come here, what I love is that if we just do a 10% growth, like, right? So I think part of it is, like, what are the one or two, three things, but then we have to make them realistic. So I think it would be impossible for us to go from 73% to 95%, right? So if we break that into smaller chunks over a shorter period of time, it helps your team feel like the goal is going to be achievable. And so if we just expand upon this a little bit more, like, where did we come up with this $5,000? And so basically, from, July 1st, 2018 to September 30th, we had 787 pairs of lenses sold. And of those 787 pairs, 571 pairs had AR on them. If we increase that by 10%, we just need to sell 70 more pairs of lenses with AR. And if we do that, our potential for revenue is a little bit over $5,000. The other thing that I love about this page, Dr. Vargo, is that, I can see, which team member do I need to hone in on a little bit more? Is it a training issue? I know we're going to dive into that in a little bit more here, but, it helps you kind of see like where you need to spend a little bit more time. And then it also allows us to see who's our superstar. And Sarah, who sold 182 lenses, her AR average is 85.2%. So I might want to spend a little bit of time with Sarah kind of understanding, like, what is she doing differently? What is she saying differently? And how can we utilize her to help train the rest of our team? So once we can understand, where we're coming from, and, Dr. Vargo, I don't know how you feel about this, but, all businesses have, money that they have to drive for, right? We have to have realistic goals. We have to continue to bring in additional revenues so that we can continue to have a building over our roof, that we can have team members, we can provide benefits. It's my belief that, if we change some behaviors, like what are those 1 or 2, 3 behaviors that we need to change? Is it a word? Is it, what is it that we can, help our team be successful? And so I guess, Dr. Vargo, I'm listening for you, like, how do we go about changing those behaviors so that we can continue to elevate the practice and take it to the next level?
Yeah, thanks you, Yvonne. Yeah, some great points there. And one thing I heard you say, and one thing I saw with what you were doing was let me go back here. Screen, there we go. It was potential. And in seeing the numbers, and yeah, so often it is a training issue. And the things we're talking about up to this point about setting clear expectations, and even the ability to look at EdgePro and see these metrics out there, it is about changing behaviors at some point. And you made a great point about having a superstar employee, let's say a superstar optician. What is that person doing differently? Well, if we can learn that, then it becomes, in many cases, a training issue, coaching and developing your other team members. And this all too often seems to be the one that nobody wants to do. And one of I kind of pull my hair out a little bit when I hear people say, well, isn't there just some website I can send people to? Isn't there just a DVD I can order? Or can't somebody just come to my office and do it for me? And I would say to that, it's just too important. The answer is yes. There are outside resources that you can use to help train your staff, but I would use those as supplements to your own internal process. I don't think there's any website or any outside individual or group that can truly understand your brand, your culture, your goals, your core values. I think you have to be involved with that. And even when we're talking about metrics and numbers, if you've got an employee that needs to be coached up, that needs to hit a certain level, if we're talking about production, so often that simply becomes a training issue. I ask this question live. I'll look at the group and I'll say, how long does it take you to train a new hire? And I'll get that question sometimes. How long should it take to train a new hire? So when I ask that question, I give them a minute, and you get a variety of looks back at you, and is it 30 days? Is it 90 days? And then I tell them, don't answer this because it's a trick question. If I were to rephrase this to say, when does training end? Then you see the light go off. And I think we all agree, training should never really end. And maybe it's a semantics issue. I realize that there's an original, let's call it an onboarding process, where you have to make sure that people have at least the rudimentary skills to be able to competently do the job. But at the same time, I don't think that should ever end. I think we've all been to businesses before where it became very clear, very quick, whether or not there was a highly engaged process of continuing to develop the employees. I think we really recognize and appreciate that as consumers when we're doing business with an organization that has highly invested in their team. And I know the pushback on this. It's going to be, I don't have time. The same thing we talked about before. And I'm sensitive to that. I realize that Optometric practices we're talking about are small businesses with limited time and limited resources. But let me share with you something that I learned on what it could look like to provide that employee development, that coaching in a practice that doesn't have a lot of time to do it. And I'm drawing from my own experience. I was practicing at one point, and I would frequently hear the technicians. Well, the patients would ask a lot questions that many of you have probably heard. What does that air puff thing do besides just, blast my eye with air? And the opticians, I would hear them say, just ask the doctor, he'll explain it. And it really didn't instill a lot of confidence, in my opinion, in the staff. But it was our fault. It wasn't their fault. Nobody had ever explained to them what the test did, so how would they have an answer? So one day what I did was called all the technicians over, and I said, I noticed that people regularly ask about that test. I'd like you to be able to have an answer. And I just spent about 5 or 10 minutes going over the test and what it checked for, how it got a reading, what normal readings were. Spent a little bit of time, didn't go into great detail, but we talked about glaucoma a little bit and how that pressure can affect the inside of the eye and the optic nerve. And I showed him a picture of what a normal nerve looked like and a nerve that had been damaged by glaucoma. And I noticed something really interesting. From that point forward, when people asked what the air puff did, they not only had an answer, but they almost seemed proud of the fact that they were able to answer that question. They almost took pride in their answer. And what I came to realize was that to continually develop your team, you don't need a lot of time. You just have to take advantage of the moments you have. And what I started doing was taking advantage of these, what I like to call 5-minute moments. When you see a patient that was, you pull them over and say, that patient that was sitting in the waiting room in the fetal position in tears, he had a corneal ulcer. This is why we have people take their contacts out at night, or why we stress wearing daily disposables. Let me talk to you a little bit about what a corneal ulcer is and how painful it can be. Or that patient that came in and couldn't see out of his left eye, that was from diabetes. Let me talk to you about why we stress so much our diabetics coming back once a year so we can check them. So if you want to develop your staff, be a teacher. I've really come to appreciate that over the years. Take advantage of those teaching moments. Every day you walk into the practice, there's these 5-minute teaching moments. Take advantage of them. It'll really pay dividends over the course of time on the knowledge and competencies of your staff, and that will not go unnoticed by your patients. I like to call these first two clearing the path for your patients to succeed, giving them clarity around what's expected of them, giving them clarity around the expectations and the vision, but also giving them the training that they need to competently do their job. Again, we need our team to work with us. This is a team effort to get to that next level. We have to do our part as leaders to make sure that they can succeed, and I call that clearing the path. From a management level, the pushback on time, I try to explain to people, and I talk with a lot of office managers as well, I'm not trying to create more work for you. I'm trying to create less work for you, because if you don't do the things you need to do to clear the path for your employees to succeed, you're going to, by default, end up in one of these bottom two categories. You're either going to end up micromanaging them because you have to, because they don't know how to do the job right, so you're going to end up having to do a lot of their work for them or fixing their mistakes for them, or you abandon them, which is essentially giving people responsibilities without support. And I can almost guarantee that in these bottom two categories, you're going to end up doing a lot more managing over the long run on the back end than if you just did more work on the front end. Some research actually in a book called The Top Reasons Employees Don't Do What They're Supposed to Do and What to Do About It found that out of, and this was based on surveys from 25,000 managers, so it's not really a small sample size, and these were the top 3 reasons from 3 to 1. They don't know what they're supposed to do, they don't know how to do it, and they don't know why they should be doing it. So it only makes sense, as far as, in my opinion, only makes sense to pay attention to these things and make sure that we're addressing them. Empowerment, number 3, and you've heard me talk about clarity, and you've heard me talk about coaching and training, but nowhere did I suggest micromanaging your employees. Quite the opposite. One of our consulting members once was talking about the office meetings that she has for her office managers, and she has a big practice, multiple locations, and once a week she would require her office managers to come together for a meeting, and the managers hated these meetings, and it really tended to be the owner, OD, telling everybody else what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. Well, the practice got bigger, and the OD's responsibilities started pulling her away from these meetings, but she insisted that the managers still get together to have these meetings. And she noticed something really interesting that came from that. The managers started coming up with their own ideas, and they were good ideas. They were ideas that she had never considered. There were solutions to problems she didn't even know existed. And she said something to me that really stuck out at me. She said, one of the most valuable things that I've learned as a practice owner was to hire good people and get out of the way. This quote is from a Steve Jobs video that I use sometimes, and I'll show live in a presentation. And he says this after somebody asked him, do employees ever disagree with you? He was talking about how in his role, he spends all day meeting with teams of people, and the interviewer said, do your employees ever disagree with you? And initially he laughed, and then he said, yes. He said, if you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions. You have to let your company be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win. And I was talking with one of our members once, and he said, I get that, but I can't let employees make decisions on things I don't agree with. And he's right. To a point, he is the owner, he's the CEO, and as owner, CEO of your business, a lot of decisions have to go through you. But my pushback to that was, don't you think you'll make better decisions with the more information you have? And if you start to shut down that process, if you create a culture where people aren't able, or your ideas aren't welcome, people will stop coming to you with ideas. So I think overall, no pun intended, a lot of practice owners have a lot of blind spots in regards to operating their practice. And I think it only benefits you to create a culture that is open to a lot of feedback from the people that you hire. And I'll also say that just because you don't agree with your employees doesn't necessarily mean that you're right. So I think sometimes you have to take a chance on your team, and you have to say, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't necessarily see it this way, but we'll try things your way, and we'll circle back next month or next quarter, and we'll see what's working and what's not. A lot of times what you'll find is that through this process, you learn a lot. And again, getting to the next level is a exercise in doing things differently and trying new things. And if you are trying new things, you're going to discover that some things you try are a home run. You keep doing it. You put your foot on the gas. You're going to discover things that don't work at all. You stop doing it. But what happens a lot of the times is you discover things that make you pivot. In other words, you'll try something different, and aspects of it work and aspects of it fail, but you pivot and you embrace the things that are working. So we talked before about the top 3 reasons employees don't do what they're supposed to do. In case you're curious, number 4 and number 5, they think your way will not work. They think their way is better. So you don't have to like this if you're a control freak, but my suggestion and my advice would be just don't ignore it. Number 4 was focusing on people's strengths, and stop trying to fix people. And not to take this too literally, obviously we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, and certainly some of our weaknesses would benefit from more coaching, more training. But I think it's also safe to say that most of us have some weaknesses that are kind of hardwired. Some of us are just by nature disorganized. Some of us have poor attention to detail. Not everybody has a high level of empathy. there was another one of our members who had an issue with somebody that she had promoted to office manager, and it was previously an optician, and by all accounts, an outstanding optician, ABO certified, really knowledgeable in this area. Patients loved working with this optician, so as practice owner, she thought, well, she's really good in that position, so obviously she's going to be strong as a practice leader, as a manager. Well, that turned out not to be the case, and as it turned out, this particular individual was impatient with other staff members once she was promoted. She thought everybody else should know what to do because she knew how to do it, and she wasn't willing to coach or train other people, which created a lot of problems in what happened there when the manager wasn't there, because she had a lot of seniority and time off, and things would fall apart when she wasn't there because nobody else was real clear on how to do their job or all the things that go into this aspect of leadership. And this OD basically called me saying, can we fix this person? And I said, we can try, but I think you would have had a lot more success either promoting someone or hiring someone whose strengths were more aligned with that particular position. And research backs this up, that we are typically and consistently more productive when we're doing things that are aligned with our strengths and interests. And sometimes this requires having a certain level of flexibility with responsibilities. So again, as you're looking at your practice and where you want to take things, understanding and recognizing how important your team is to that, I think it's really beneficial to observe the people on your team. And this is something that good managers do really well, is they're always observing people on the team and trying to recognize what their strengths are. How do we leverage and double down on people's strengths? How do we put them in positions where they're going to be strongest in moving this practice to the next level? And is it possible to put them in positions that mitigate their weaknesses? Lastly, I'll round out with accountability. And I'm going to tell you that this one is really the glue that holds everything else together. If you're not willing to hold people accountable for outcomes, everything else just falls apart. And all too often, I'll hear from practices that have the strategies in place. They have ideas, they have a vision, they have goals, but they're not able to get the team on board. And when I ask, what are the consequences for employees not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it can just be crickets on the phone. So how do you hold people accountable? Once you've defined the goal, once you've been clear with yourself and you've provided a clear vision for the employees and given them the training and the resources they need to succeed, once we've defined the metrics for them, how do you hold people accountable for outcomes? I think first let's look at your own competencies in doing this, and then we'll circle back to how to address it. Are you terrible at holding people accountable? And this is actually not my word. This was a Harvard study that asked office managers, people in management position that surveyed people, and half the people they surveyed classified themselves as terrible at holding people accountable. So again, how do we do that? Do you follow people around all day, looking over their shoulder, just waiting for people to mess up? Well, I don't think that's probably not going to be a very good approach toward that. That type of culture typically leads to low morale and high turnover. So I prefer approach more aligned with what you might see in the corporate world. And, it's just a process of getting people to hold themselves accountable to some degree by having to report on their outcomes. And one of the best definitions I've ever heard for accountability is getting people to perform in a way in which they know in advance they're going to have to account for their performance at a later date. So again, once we've been really clear about what our next level is and been really clear with what people need to do to move the needle in that direction, accountability is getting people to perform in a way in which they know in advance that they're going to have to account for their performance at a later date. I'm a really big advocate for one-on-one meetings, and not just once a year at an annual review, but somewhat of a regular cadence. It's a great opportunity to check in with people and just see how are things going. Do you need anything from me? It's a great opportunity to give positive feedback, which isn't just stroking someone's ego, but it's information that people need to make sure that they know what they're doing right, so they keep doing it. But it's also an opportunity to give constructive feedback as well on things that need to improve. If they're not doing the things that they need to do that are meeting their own objectives, it's an opportunity to intervene, to find out why, and provide support, provide feedback, provide coaching, whatever that person needs to continue doing the things that are aligned with what they need to do. When there's no accountability, the real danger here is complacency. And really, this webinar is built around doing things different. It is, as Yvonne pointed out, behavior change. If we want to go to that next level, we have to do things different. In practices where there's good intentions, there's good strategies, but there's no execution, then there's complacency, which tends to set in when no one is really pushing for improvement. And that probably defines the practice I described earlier that said they came back from the conference with all these great ideas, but eventually went back to doing things the old way. So as we close out here, I just want to mention that this webinar really touched on a lot of leadership topics. Because if you want to take your practice to the next level, it's absolutely going to require leadership. It's going to require a clear vision and strategy. It's going to require execution. It's going to require the ability to effectively lead others to the next level. And we talked about three things here, basically. We talked about what to do, getting really clear on that vision around the what. What are we trying to get to? What's our next level? And defining that for the staff as well. We talked about how. We really stressed the importance of actually doing, not just talking about things, not just creating a vision, but actually executing and making sure that we're doing the things we need to do, but also making sure that the staff is doing the things that they need to do as well, and holding them accountable and holding ourselves accountable as well for the execution aspect of this. And we talked about why. Why is this important? And creating a vision around something that you're passionate about and being able to communicate that to the staff as well, to get people to go beyond just doing a job, but also be inspired to do the job that you're asking them to do, and very much see this as a team-oriented approach. And I'm going to close out with one final question, and that question is, what if? What if you started doing some things differently, and that vision that we talked about earlier that I asked you to write down on a piece of paper, what if that actually came true? So with that, I'm going to close out. Thank you very much for tuning in. Look, Yvonne, I'm going to turn this back over to you, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vargo. And yes, we do have quite a few questions. So the first question that is being posed are like, you talked about motivators, and you talked about like money not being like the sole focus, and you stress that, gosh, if you've got a superstar, let's go ahead and pay them, top dollar, right? So what would be your top two motivators outside of money, since we're going to pay somebody amazingly well? What would be your one or two motivators that would really help drive and take the practice to the next level?
Yeah, well, I think that helps to know people and what's important to them. And this is where we really get into going from a macro level to a micro level. I think we look at money, and again, I hope it came across in the webinar. I don't dismiss money. I think it's very important. But at the same time, I think it's convenient to look at that as something that would that always drives people, and it's just not. So I think we have to get to know people and understand what motivates them. Two ways to motivate: fear or inspire. And to some degree, I think both are relevant. There is a certain level of healthy fear that goes into and I say healthy because it can quickly get unhealthy, but when we're holding people accountable and people understand that they are going to be held to certain expectations, I think it's fair to expect them to do that. But at the same time, so some of it is just that. I honestly think that people aren't always going to feel motivated. I don't, you don't. Sometimes we just have to put a system in place where people know what's expected of them, and we follow the system. But at the same point, as far as the inspire part goes, get to know your employees. Find out what's interesting to them. Maybe it is money for certain employees. For other employees, it's praise. For other employees, it's professional development. For other employees, it's helping them get to the next level in their career. So when you really understand the neuroscience behind all of this, you understand that one of the main motivators for people is opportunity. So I would look to that. If there's any way that I can provide an opportunity for my employees, I would hammer down on that, because I think once you identify that, and if you can provide that, you'll really not only have motivated employees, but loyal employees as well.
I couldn't agree more. And, I think about, you mentioned it a little bit in just a second ago, where you talked about, is there somebody who wants to raise their level of professionalism, whether it's they become ABO certified, or if they're in a licensure state that supports, opticianry, or maybe they want to become, certified as a para-optometric. We can spend a lot of money investing in people to help raise their level of expectation. And one of the questions was posed was, I can do all the right things, and I can inspire, I can provide opportunities, but what happens when I invest in this particular individual and they leave?
Right. Well, my answer to that would be, what if you don't invest in that individual and they stay?
Right.
That's what I see all too often.
Right, and that just leads to the complacency that you spoke to just a little bit ago.
Right.
I think the other really cool thing that you talked about earlier today was, setting clear expectations with your team. What are your thoughts on handoff as it relates from, doctors educating in the lane and then handing off to, an optical team member?
Sure, yeah. I think the closer you can get to a seamless handoff, the better. I will tell you that we're seeing more practices doing some kind of a model around scribing, and even what we call it at IDEC a super tech model, where there is a consistency in message, where there'll be somebody in the office that's scribing for the doctor, who will, in some cases, become the optician. So they've been there through the process of the exam, and then they're taking the patient out to the optical, where it's really just continuing the discussion, or in some cases, they'll have heard the entire conversation and can communicate that to the optician. But I do think that there needs to be that moment of sharing that information, so there is a understanding by the optician, and there's not that breakdown in communication. We don't have enough time, but if we did, I could go on and on about all the things that the doctor could do in their part during the exam to make sure that we're asking the right questions, sharing the right information, presenting things in the right form to really get people interested in wanting to go into the optical and take their eye purchasing experience, whatever we want to call it, to the next level. Maybe you guys can have me back to have that webinar at another time.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Right, I've been in way too many practices where it was zero handoff, and it just kind of fell apart. And then practices that was handoff was amazing and everything went through the roof. So
I do think the handoff is, and I do think the handoff is important, but at the same time, to some degree, people have already made their mind up in a lot of cases. Then the handoff doesn't matter as much. So I think the doctor shares a much bigger role in this than they're aware of. And again, that's a whole nother topic. But I think the closer you can get to streamlining that, the better.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And then lastly, the accountability piece was, I think you hit the nail on the head. Right, if we don't hold people accountable, then everything just kind of is going to remain complacent. We're never going to take our practice to the next level. And I think that that's an area where people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And, do you have any tips or tricks in being able to provide our audience on how to hold people a little bit more accountable when it may be a little uncomfortable?
Yeah, what I try to do is remove the discomfort because I get it. I really do. People don't like confrontation. I don't like confrontation. So my approach is typically to try to get employees to hold themselves accountable. And some of this is around a team approach, creating a culture where you don't want to let other people down. But also on an individual level, the reason I like the idea of requiring employees to report to you is because in some ways they have to hold themselves accountable. Let's just take Edge Pro data, for example. Let's say that capture rate or what a AR percentage, whatever data metrics we were tracking for an individual, that once a month as part of your monthly meeting or maybe it's quarterly, that they had to produce that report and come to you. Well, in general, people aren't going to want to keep having to look their boss in the eye and explain why they continue to underperform relative to expectations that have been clearly set for them. Now, all too often, accountability falls through the crack because these conversations aren't happening or they're not followed up on. It might be a one-time conversation that nobody revisits. But when your employees understand that this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and again, that's what this was all built around, providing clear expectations so people know what's expected of them. When you know you're going to have to sit down with your boss or your superior on somewhat of a regular cadence and account for your performance, the hope here is that your behavior will change along the way, because you don't want that awkward conversation of once again having to go in and having to explain why you underperform. So hopefully we would start to see these behavior changes to get the kind of production that we need out of people. When people are clear on what's expected of them and they don't do it, I would initially in a management position step in a supportive role. How can I help you get there? What do you need from me? Are you better suited for a different role? But at some point the conversation does move to a bit more stern in terms of, if you're just not doing this because you're not coachable or you're not willing to, the conversation starts to move from how can I help you to, if things don't improve here, we might have to consider making some changes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Vargo. I know this was, we're right at our time here, and want to thank all of our attendees for joining us, not only in our fifth webinar, but all throughout the previous webinars as well. Dr. Vargo, thank you for your time. This was valuable information. If anybody has any additional questions, Dr. Vargo has graciously extended his email address, which is on the screen. Additionally, if you need some support or you're new to Edge Pro and want to learn more about it, we do have some URLs here that are in the bottom left hand and right hand of our screen. So feel free to copy those down as well. And then just as a reminder, the recording will be available to you guys by the end of the week. You can also find it in the Need Help section within Edge Pro, and as well as you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar. Please don't forget about the survey, which was at the top of our chat session at the very start. And again, on behalf of G10 Technologies and the Edge Pro team, we thank you guys very much for attending. And Dr. Vargo, thank you again very much.
This was fun. Thank you, Yvonne. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All righty. Thanks, everyone.